This meeting is being recorded.
All right, now that we have the right gospel passage, we're in Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse 53 tonight. So we have been following this whole journey through the gospel, seeing that Jesus was introduced to us right at the very beginning as the Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And we saw that identity then demonstrated in the first half of the gospel through that question, who is this? And we see that he's the one who has the authority to drive out evil spirits, the authority to heal, the authority to forgive sins, and that several times he is recognized as he comes on the scene, teaching that the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God has come near, and calling people to repent and to believe in the good news. They often have incidents when people recognize who he is, and particularly the evil spirits. And of course, Jesus often tells them not to tell anybody. And then in the middle of the gospel, we have that turning point when Jesus asked his disciples, who do they say he is? And Peter announces, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus at that point sternly warns him not to tell anyone about him. But Jesus begins then to go into the passion predictions. He has three predictions when he foretells about his death and his resurrection, his suffering, death, and resurrection, all three of those aspects. And he's going to be undergo this suffering, be rejected by the Jewish religious leaders, be killed, but then after 3 days rise again. And we see 3 times he does that. After each of those, the disciples show that they don't understand the nature of Jesus's kingdom, that their understanding of discipleship is more about power. And Jesus says that no, discipleship is about 2 things: taking up the cross and service, that just as he came to serve and not to be served, that's what disciples are called to do, is to live this life of service. Then Jesus enters into Jerusalem, and when he goes in, he cleanses the temple, basically shuts down the temple. He goes into arguments with the chief priest and the I'm sorry, not the chief priest yet, the scribes and the Pharisees. I'm on to tonight's passage in my mind, but the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And in each case, the Herodians are in the mix there too. Each case he shows that that he gets the one up on them, that he is superior to their argumentation, and truly basically silences each one of those groups. And as a result of all that, they desire to kill him, and they find a willing partner in that, in the person of Judas. And we saw last week how on that evening they share the Passover, and Jesus foretells both the betrayal and the denial that will happen. And Jesus prays in the garden, that very emotional prayer, as he's asking God, the Father, to let this cup pass from him, but yet not what Jesus wants, but what God wants. And so Jesus continues to go towards the cross. And we saw in the garden as he is betrayed by Judas, and then he is brought before the councils, where we pick it up tonight. So the last thing we saw, where all of the disciples had left him and fled, we saw a young man, this interesting young man that we don't really have a full solution for, but a lot of interesting ideas of this man who left his linen cloth and ran off naked. And so Jesus has been basically completely abandoned by his disciples. And that's when the story picks up, and we are in 1453. So if we could read 1453 to 65, this is Jesus before the council, before the Sanhedrin. So if someone could read those verses.
I will.
Thank you, Martha.
And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. But Jesus followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. And the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus and put him to death, and found none. To put him to death, and found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. And some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard this blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be worthy of death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands.
Thank you, Martha, for reading that section. So Jesus was in the garden during the betrayal, so he's been led from there. So our scene changes now, and we're in this Jewish assembly of leaders. We have chief priests that are mentioned, elders, and scribes, all three of these groups that are noted. And then it notes that who else was following?
Peter.
Peter. So Peter followed, but how closely?
Not
distance.
close.
Not close at all, at a distance. And so you have Peter at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. So Peter's in there, and it's noted that Peter was warming himself at the fire, which would say, oh, he was cold, so he must have been looking for a way to stay warm. But the other thing that we see is, who was he with?
The servants.
The guards. So he was studying with the guards or the servants of the council. So that is interesting here that that Peter follows at a distance. He's far off in a sense. He's sitting with the temple guards, warming himself. What was his calling? Do you remember what the calling of the disciples was back in the very early part of the gospel?
Prophesy.
That wasn't their calling in the beginning of the gospel.
Fishers of men.
There was the calling to be fishers of men, and that's appropriate one, not the one that I'm trying to get at this point, but
Right.
that was the first call to Peter. But the call to all 12 of the disciples came in chapter 3, and these are the ones that he appointed. And here's what it said. He appointed 12 who he named apostles. This is in chapter 3, verse 14. And he appointed them to be with him. He was, here is this one who's called to be with Jesus, but he is with the guards. And so interesting. What we have here too, if you notice in Mark's gospel, and we didn't read the whole section because I just divided it up, but we have one of these other sandwich kind of techniques. Peter is introduced here, but Peter doesn't come back till at the end of this trial scene. And so Mark puts the trial of Jesus right in between the two episodes here with Peter. I think what's interesting about that is it really makes us compare and contrast kind of, we could say, Jesus's trial with Peter's trial, because they're both on trial here in different ways. So the chief priest and the council, they're all looking for testimony against Jesus. basically, they really want to put him to death. There's a strong emphasis here in this section, I think, on Jesus's innocence, in the sense that they can't find any testimony. It's already told right at the very beginning in 55. It tells us that they found none, that they couldn't really find any real evidence or anything against him. And so right away we're told that, and that's a theme that will continue throughout this, the Passion narrative too, is that Jesus doesn't do anything that really deserves death, but yet that is what happens. So they seek this testimony to help them to make their plan of killing him come to a reality. We know that they've been seeking that throughout the gospel, and then especially in the last couple chapters, even more fervently. They can't trump up any evidence against him, though, only false testimony. And it says that they get all these various things, but none of them agree. So they couldn't find any agreement. There's different things that are being said. And ironically, this whole trial, it's a sham, but it also is violating the law against false testimony, which is one of the basic ideas of the Torah and the Ten Commandments, is it shouldn't bear false witness. And here, false witness is at the very heart of what results in Jesus being brought to death. And so this trial really is seen as violating the whole Torah and the essence of the Torah. But there is one of the false testimonies that Mark highlights for us, and he gives us the substance of what was said in one of these statements. And it centers on some words that are attributed to Jesus. So what did they say that they heard Jesus say?
He'll destroy the temple.
Yeah, so they said he will destroy, and in the way it's told here, I will destroy this temple. And there's two things that there's this contrast. So this temple, and how does he describe the temple?
It's made with hands.
So it's this physical kind of temple, that physical structure of the temple that is there in Jerusalem. Well, it's interesting that in Mark's gospel, Jesus never does make this statement.
No, he didn't.
It's never was said here. And so this is the first time that's brought up. However, we do know that he went into the temple and he basically shut it down, and he pronounced a curse upon the temple. And so we know that he did that. And we know that when Mark 13, when the disciples are marveling at the great edifice of the temple and how amazing that structure is, that Jesus tells them that that it's going to fall and be torn down. So we do know that. But he emphasizes that it's a temple made with hands. And then he uses the word 3 days, I'll build another. And what does he say about that temple?
Made
Without
without
hands.
hands.
So made without hands. So we see this contrast of hands and no hands. And so in one sense, then this is a true statement, right? That this is what Jesus does. But it's also so that, again, it's the irony that these testimonies that people are kind of trying to bring against him are proclaiming what is actually the truth, that Jesus is going to be the one who is the new temple. And in 3 days, which makes us think of what would 3 days make us think of if we know the end of the story?
Resurrection.
The resurrection. So this whole idea of 3 days, building a new temple, Jesus being the new temple, and it's a temple not made with hands. And so it's this idea that it's the spiritual temple that is Jesus's own body. And so unwittingly here, they're speaking the truth of what will happen. And so we see that Jesus, remember when it said that the one who is would be the cornerstone, would be the rejected one, the one that was rejected. And here it is, Jesus becoming the cornerstone of the new temple. How does Jesus respond to all this?
Silent.
Yeah, silence. So the high priest asked, hey, do you have an answer? And Jesus is silent. And he doesn't feel the need to respond to these contradictory witnesses and to all this testimony and this false testimony. But the high priest, he really is trying to goad Jesus into making some sort of response. And again, the high priest asked him straight out here, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" So he's seeking this word, something that Jesus will say that will incriminate himself. And through his silence, he's been kind of just not giving any credence to anything that's been said. But now he asked this question, and the two things that he asked here take us back to the very first verse of Mark's gospel. Jesus was introduced in the very first verse as Jesus Christ, the Son of God. What are the two questions here?
Are you the Christ?
Are you the Christ? That's
Son.
right. Are you the Christ? That word Christ, Messiah, it's the same word, the anointed one. Are you the one that is expected? And then the second question is the Son of the Blessed One. So the Blessed One, this is one of those times when you see this a lot in the Gospel of Matthew, when it talks about the kingdom of heaven rather than the kingdom of God, that the Jewish people had this, it's called circumlocution is the big word for it. Hey, that's the word of the day. But this idea where they try to avoid saying God's name, and so they use another term. And so when it's saying Son of the Blessed or Son of the Blessed One, it is indicating you're the Son of God. So that's the question. And Jesus answers,
I am.
I am.
I am. So again, think about it. The first half of the gospel, Jesus was like always silencing those who would identify him as the Son of God or as the Messiah. And now here he accepts that title, both titles, as I am. And that word itself is significant. I am, because that's like the name of God, Yahweh in the Old Testament. It's the same thing he said when they were on the boat. And he said, "Do not be afraid, I am." So you have this idea that Jesus is maybe saying even more than even the questions are here, that he's pointing to his divinity. But I think in this whole section, then he's making this point that his revelation, and I think this is so significant, Jesus has never fully said, "I'm the Messiah." Even when the disciples said it, he still never just came out and said it until this point when he's right here at his suffering. Why? Why is it that Jesus finally accepts it at this point, do you think?
It goes back to when we studied John, my hour has come.
Yeah. And that's right. The hour has come. This is the time. This is where Jesus will be fully revealed. And this is where the nature of his kingdom will be fully demonstrated. And it's the kind of what everything has been pointing to. It's the climax. It's the culmination of all of that, where he's been teaching us that discipleship is taking up a cross, that discipleship means to suffer, that discipleship means to serve, that discipleship means to give your life for others. And here is the point where Jesus is fully ready to demonstrate that, and he's showing his total and full acceptance of all that means of being the Messiah, and allowing people to see, here it is. This is the point of my revelation. It is the point where I am suffering. That's where my role as the Messiah is seen. It's as the crucified one. That's where I'm fully revealed as the Son of God, because it's at the cross. It's at the cross. It's in the suffering and the cross that Jesus and his identity is most fully revealed. And it's through the cross when he makes these two statements. He says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. I think he's saying, in a sense, it's through the cross that he will establish himself at the right hand of power. And it's through the cross that he will ultimately exercise authority as the Son of Man. And it's as the cross that will allow him then to be the Son of God, who comes with great power and great glory in order to gather the elect when he comes in the clouds. And so this act of the cross demonstrates that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. And ultimately through the resurrection, I think you have to see it all as kind of one whole act, the cross and the resurrection, will demonstrate that he's the vindicated one, the vindicated Son of Man. That's what those passages talk about, that he references there. It's as the Son of Man that's the vindicated one in the book of Daniel, that he is through the cross and the resurrection, the one who will be seated at the right hand of God, to whom all authority will be given. And so Jesus fully, at this point, in response to this question, accepts the identity that was described at the very beginning of this gospel, and that Mark has been pointing us to all throughout his story. So a very powerful moment, and really a very significant moment within Mark's telling of Jesus's story. Well, it appears that the high priest, through his questioning, has achieved their goal. He has something now, that he at least says that this, what Jesus has said, how does he characterize it?
What further need do we have?
Yeah, we don't have any need because it's blasphemy. That's the word that he uses,
Yeah.
right? You've heard his blasphemy. And we don't need any more witnesses. So he basically lets go of the whole trial, and he has this act, the physical act of ripping his clothes, which is to show the horror. And it was a public gesture to really point to a blasphemous act. And basically he says, we don't need any, let's do away with due process. We don't need any more witnesses. What Jesus has said, that's enough to condemn him. And so again, here's the irony, that Jesus has just said this full thing, and he said the full truth, but yet it is called blasphemy. And we as readers know it's the truth. And yet what this high priest is doing, the chief, is by pushing Jesus towards the cross, he's actually fulfilling what Jesus has said would happen, and he's fulfilling God's purposes and God's designs. And so when he turns to the Sanhedrin for the decision, it seems that it is a unanimous verdict. It says all of them. So all of them condemned him as deserving death. And then some of them began to put physical abuse on him, and they suffer him, cause him to suffer. And they strike him, and they spit upon him. And all of this, if you're remembering when Jesus said, I'm going to be mocked and tortured, these are the kind of things that are happening and are going to continue happening. And all of that is also a fulfillment. And I should have said this too when he was silent. That's also a fulfillment of the one of the servant songs in the book of Isaiah, that the suffering servant in Isaiah 50, that one was probably in Isaiah 50, chapter 50. Yeah, that's where I have it. Chapter 50. And that's also where the mockery also happens at the suffering servant of Isaiah. And we see that he's specifically spat upon. And so this is some of the fulfillment of what Isaiah talked about, as he talked about the one who would come and suffer on behalf of God's people. And so they place a cover on his face, they blindfold him, it says, so that he's not able to see his assailants, and they are striking him and blowing these kind of punches and slapping him because of his self-revelation. And then they basically demand him to do what?
Prophesy.
Yeah, prophesy. And I think again here they demand that he will prophesy, and the irony is that all of this is a fulfillment of what Jesus already did prophesy. He had prophesied this in his passion predictions to the disciples 3 different times. And we're going to see a specific fulfillment of prophecy in the very next part of this story, that he had told the disciples that they would deny him. And we're going to see, he specifically singled out Peter, and we're going to see that fully comes to fruition here. And so the prophecies of Jesus are being fulfilled. And so Jesus has been condemned, and the scene closes with this abuse from the ones who are beating upon him. And then we're brought back then to the story of Peter that we'll pick up. But before we move on, are there any other questions or observations or things you would like to point out in that section?
On my part.
It's a very significant part. Sometimes we forget about that trial and we move right into the trial of Pilate that comes up after this. But this trial is very significant in the way that Mark tells the story. Let's look at and we're going to continue Peter's story, that story that began back in verse 54. And let's look at verses 66 to 72. Someone could read those verses for us.
I will.
Thank you, Pauline.
While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. He began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept.
Thank you, Pauline. So Peter, remember, he is still in the courtyard, which was where he was when we last saw him at verse 54, and he is with the temple guards. And then we have a maidservant, or one of the servant girls of the high priest is introduced, and she comes and she sees Peter there, and she makes a statement. And what is her accusation?
You're one of them. You were with Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's very significant. Is what is the accusation? You were with Jesus. What was Peter called to do?
Be with Jesus.
Be with Jesus. That was the calling of the disciples, that they would be with Jesus. He appointed them to be with him. And here is one saying, you were with Jesus. You're one of his disciples. In other words, you were with Jesus. That's the sign of discipleship. And she specifically singles out the fact that Jesus is from Nazareth. That will come into play here in a moment in the story when Peter is his language. He must talk like a Galilean, must be the indication there. So I think that part helps to associate with him with Jesus. But what's Peter's response to the maidservant's accusation that you were with Jesus?
Doesn't understand what she's saying.
Yeah. And I love the irony here in the way that this is. In one hand, Peter is kind of denying it. No, I don't understand what you're saying. And he refuses to say he was with Jesus. So he's refusing to the what it means to be a disciple. But on the other hand is when he says he doesn't understand what she's talking about, the truth is that Peter never really did understand what it meant to be with Jesus. He never understood what discipleship meant. And he's demonstrated throughout the gospel, when Jesus says, I'm going to suffer. Oh no, Peter rebukes him. And when Jesus says, these different calls that he has, and Peter's always the one, no, Jesus, you won't die. No, we're not going to give up on you. He doesn't understand what discipleship is all about. He doesn't understand what following Jesus is all about. And so again here is he's saying the truth. I don't really understand this. I don't get it. And so there's a little bit of double understanding. In one sense, it's a denial for sure. And in the other sense, it's Peter saying, hey, I don't get what discipleship is about. And we all would say, yeah. But anyway, he then that leads him to further scrutiny as he comes out. And Mark tells us that as he going out into the other part of the gateway, that the cock crowed. So that's the first time that happened. And so we're told that, which reminds us of what Jesus has said prior. But he can't escape this maidservant, can he? So he's left to go to the gateway, and she sees him again. And what's the accusation this time is,
This is one of them.
yeah, this man's one of them. So it's that he's one of them. And that's the statement that comes here. And again, Peter denies it, verse 70. So he denies his association with the disciples, one of them, that he denies that he was part of that. And then after a little while, the bystanders again, so this is not necessarily just the maidservant, but a group of bystanders say to Peter, you're one of them. Certainly you're one of them. You're a Galilean. And so there must have been something about the way Peter spoke or dressed or something that indicated that he was not from there and that he was associated with this Jesus of Nazareth. But this is the most explicit denial. And what does he say at this case?
I don't know this guy.
I don't know him. I don't know this man that you're talking about. So this is a complete disassociation from Jesus. And he introduces that by saying that he began to curse and swore an oath. So as he calls down this curse and swears an oath, it's really pointing to he's saying something that he is verifying that it's true. This is like a notary public or testifying in court type of thing when he tries to say this. And his statement, what's amazing is it even goes beyond what they said. They said, oh, you are one of them. Well, what Peter says is what?
I don't know this man.
I don't know this man. So you were one of them. I don't know him. I don't know this man. So his denial even goes beyond what they accused him of, because they hadn't spoken of Jesus. And so you see this steady growth in the denial, that Peter first denies understanding what it's about. Then he denies the association with the 12. And then finally, he denies all knowledge of Jesus. And immediately in this kind of sad scene, and it's amazing, beautiful ways beautiful but also sad ways in which these stories are told. We then hear the cock crow a second time, and we're reminded of what Jesus had said, and Peter is as well. His action is to remember. He remembered all that, he remembered what Jesus had said, and we're told that specific prophecy again. And so here's the thing. What did they say to him at the end in that Jewish trial? Prophesy. Well, here it is. Jesus's prophecies are fulfilled. Jesus said, you will deny me 3 times before the cock crows twice. Peter does it. And Peter breaks down and weeps and collapses. This is Peter's final appearance. We aren't going to see him again until after the resurrection and all that. And so all the disciples have fled. From this point on, it's only women who will follow Jesus and be with him. And as we'll see that later on. So thinking about this, so he starts with Peter, then he goes to the Jewish trial, and then he returns to Peter. I think it really allows us to see several contrasts between Jesus and Peter. Jesus, he has submitted himself to fully to the unfolding events that's going to happen, knowing that these things must happen. He's made that determination, and he's walking in obedience. Peter is driven by self self-protection and self-preservation, and that's what's driving him. Jesus is in this whole thing is acted upon by others, and he's passive. They're doing things to him. Peter is active. He chooses how he will respond to these questions. Jesus is the center of attention in the chief priest house. Peter is lurking on the fringes outside. Jesus is questioned by these authorities, and this contrast is interesting, right? Jesus is questioned by the authorities that have the ultimate power to accuse him of crimes and lead to his death, while there's a servant girl who is the one that's questioning Peter. And so it's like, here's Jesus dealing with these ones who can really ultimately bring about death, and Peter, when he's questioned by a girl and an anonymous and these other anonymous bystanders, he can't even answer and be clear. Jesus, it's all about false accusations. The questions that Peter answering are truth. Jesus answers and reveals his identity. Peter lies about his knowledge of Jesus, denies who he was. Jesus is accused of blasphemy, but Peter is calling down curses. And then Jesus is beaten, and Peter humiliates himself. And so we see this contrast that both of these, Jesus himself is on trial, but his disciple Peter is also on trial, and Peter fails the test. Any questions or observations on the Peter's denial?
Is there any significance that the girl approached Peter and said, what she did to him, that she did it instead of a gentleman or a man?
I don't know that there's a significance other than the fact I think it's highlighting that generally a maidservant, a woman servant, wouldn't be someone of high importance, right, within the full scheme. It's a patriarchal culture at this time. And so Peter can't even acknowledge Christ before this young, I'm saying young, I don't know if she was young, I put that in the story, this maidservant, this female servant, and if you can't even, it's almost like if you can't even acknowledge Jesus before her, he's not going to acknowledge Jesus before anybody. I think that might be the significance of the fact that it's singled out as a maidservant. Did you have another idea?
Not I.
No.
No, I'm as we were reading that, before, girls or women did not approach a man to tell him anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't really seen for a while the women characters, and we're going to see women playing some key roles here. Any other thoughts or questions or observations? All right, let's look at moving into chapter 15. We're going to change the settings a little bit. So what we're going to see in this chapter before we begin reading it is Jesus is going to be led to first of all, Pilate and his headquarters. Then he's going to go to Golgotha and ultimately to the grave. And in this chapter, across all three of those locations, there's this movement, and it goes back and forth. It goes from Jesus to another character. So Jesus, Barabbas, Jesus, soldiers, Jesus, passersby, Jesus, women, and then finally Jesus. And at the center of this whole thing is the central scene, which is in verses 21 to 25, and that is the center is the crucifixion. The ultimate center of the whole passage is where he is crucified and seen to be the Messiah and the Son of God. So it's neat the way that this chapter is structured and the alternating characters. And so we're going to follow that. We're going to go from Jesus, and then we'll go to Barabbas, and then Jesus, and then the soldiers, and then Jesus, so forth. So let's start then with the first section that focuses on Jesus and his self-revelation as the Roman hearing begins, and that is in 15, 1 through 5. So if someone could read those first 5 verses for us.
I will.
Thank you, Susan.
Immediately in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you." But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled.
Thank you, Susan. So it's now morning, so that points out that that sham trial was taking place overnight. And so here in the morning, the council has bound Jesus and they've led him to Pilate, who was the Roman governor at the time, likely has traveled into Jerusalem because what time of year is it?
Passover.
It's Passover. So it's this festival when rioting and other things would have been feared, some sort of insurrection. And so it's that time when he kind of comes to bring law and order and to the city. And so that's likely why he is there. And as he's there, they can consult with him, and they led and handed him over. That word "handed over," or this is kind of the term that has been used several times. The fact that Jesus will be handed over or passed over and given into the hands of another. And all this is the same word that was used of the betrayal of Jesus. It's the same word that Jesus talked about in his passion predictions, that the Son of Man would be handed over. And so it's interesting that the actions, which are clearly misguided and wrong in the way that they're treating Jesus, are ultimately fulfilling God's purposes and God's plans. When Jesus says that this will happen to the Son of Man, and these are the things that must happen, Jesus said, well, here's the people that are fulfilling it. And so they are being unwitting agents of God's plan to deliver up his Son for the salvation of the world. So Pilate's question, what's Pilate's question to Jesus?
Are you the king of the Jews?
Jews?
So King of the Jews, it's focusing on kind of the political question, the question of, what's your royal status? Of course, that would be significant for Pilate because in Pilate's world, who's the king?
Caesar.
Caesar. So it's the emperor, it's Caesar in the Roman world. And so if in fact Jesus is claiming to be a king, well, that would be some sort of treasonous act and could be seen as a threat. And so the answer that Jesus gives is, what did he say in your translations?
Yes,
You
it
say
is as
so.
you say.
So your translation says, yes, it is as you say. Someone
Mhm.
says what?
You say so.
You say so. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so it is kind of it's a little bit more ambiguous than just yes. It's more of a I'm accepting it without clearly it's more of a, and I think it's a clear acceptance of the title, but I do think it's kind of it's what you say. It's kind of, yeah, you said it, but Jesus himself doesn't really totally repeat it. And so he's just saying in some level, I think Jesus is playing this role in the way that Mark tells the story, that he is pointing out that Pilate is speaking the truth, even though Pilate doesn't realize he's speaking the truth. And you're going to see that phrase "King of the Jews" 3 different times leading up to the cross. And so I think it's very significant that Jesus is seen as King of the Jews. And so that's his question. I think he accepts Pilate's designation here, and he accepts these words, but what that really means is going to be revealed throughout the rest of this narrative. Well, at that point, we see that the chief priests are back on the scene, and they begin accusing him of many things. So they're like, "Hey, and they bring a bunch of other charges. And so Pilate asked for a response. Do you have an answer to all these many charges that they bring against you? And how does Jesus reply to that?
Nothing.
No
Nothing.
reply.
So he has this silence. It reminds us again of the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, says nothing, even as these charges are brought against him. And the truth is, I think here is Jesus has nothing more to say. The truth already been proclaimed. It's been proclaimed in his response to what he said at the high priest trial and questioning there, when he said, I am, to the question of, are you the Messiah? And are you the Son of the Most High? Yes. And are you the King of the Jews? Yes. And with the acceptance of those two titles, what's needed to be said has been said, and the truth has been proclaimed. He is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He is the Son of Man. He is the King of the Jews. And so nothing more needs to be said. How does that strike Pilate? What response does it cause in him?
He was
He
amazed.
marveled.
Was amazed.
Marveled, amazement. When else do we see marveled and amazement in Mark's gospel? Do you remember other times we've seen that?
When this responded to Jesus' answers
Jesus's answers.
to the scribes and the rulers.
Yeah,
when they questioned
sometimes
him.
we saw it in his when he answered them and they were amazed. And in those cases, it was often the crowds, right? They were amazed, they were marveled. So this is kind of the response to Jesus of those that have witnessed his activity, witnessed his miracles, witnessed and heard his teaching or his confrontations with religious leaders and marveled. But it kind of says that you're part of the crowd. You're not a disciple, but you're part of the crowd that's kind of intrigued by Jesus. And so I think Pilate plays that role. He's clearly not a disciple, and that's clear. But there's some sense in which, in the way that Mark tells the story here, Pilate is interested in Jesus and intrigued by Jesus. And so just like those crowds that witnessed his miracles, he's not accepting Jesus. He's not becoming his disciple by any means, but he is one of those that is in the crowd. And of course, that's not the place that Mark wants us to be. He wants us to come out of the crowd into the walk of discipleship. And we'll see that there is someone who does that in this portion of the story, but it's not Pilate. He's just kind of puzzled. Okay, any observations so far? Well, let's look at the next part of the story. It centers in, so the focus has been on Jesus. Now the focus is going to center in on Barabbas. And so let's look at that in 6 through 11. Someone could read that, please.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Helen.
Full season, the governor used to release one prisoner requested by the people. As it happened, a man known as Barabbas was then in custody with the rebels who had committed murder in the rising. When the crowd appeared and began asking for the usual favor, Pilate replied, "Would you like me to release the King of the Jews?" For he knew it was out of malice that Jesus had been handed over to him. But the chief priests incited the crowd to ask instead for the release of Barabbas. Pilate spoke. I'm sorry. Okay.
Thank you. So appreciate that. So Mark opens this up. He tells us about a custom. So what was the custom?
Releasing one prisoner.
So yeah, it was one prisoner, and it seemed to be that was whoever I'm assuming that would be the crowd, whoever they asked the Jewish people. So he gives that. Then Mark introduces a character that's currently held in prison. His name's Barabbas. The name Barabbas, I think John's telling of the story makes a bigger point of this, but the name Barabbas itself means son of the father. And so you have this son of the Father, who is this insurrectionist, and then Jesus, who is the true son of the Father. But interesting name meaning there, a little bit of irony. In Matthew's gospel, we're told that his first name is Jesus. So that's kind of interesting. You have Jesus Barabbas and Jesus of Nazareth. So Barabbas, we're told, what are we told about our buddy?
Resurrection. He was a revolutionary.
Yeah, revolutionary, committed murder and insurrection. So he's an insurrectionist, pretty much rebellious. You get the sense that Barabbas was the kind of leader that the crowds might have been seeking on Palm Sunday when Jesus comes into the city. Someone that's going to come in and turn the city upside down and begin a revolution. That's the kind of character that Barabbas was. And so he was guilty of committing murder. He must have killed people during that insurrection. And then the crowd comes and they kind of just appear, and they begin to ask Pilate to do according to the custom. So it appears that that they're the ones that that bring up the custom. And so in the way that this story is told, the initiative for releasing a prisoner, it comes from the crowd. And then that's when Pilate brings up, oh, here, why don't I release for you the King of the Jews? So that they just bring up the custom. They don't ask specifically for Barabbas at that point. Pilate suggests, well, why don't I release for you this one, the King of the Jews, which is the second time that term has been used in this chapter. And he, in some sense, has accepted Jesus' self-revelation, despite his confusion over the silence that Jesus had brought against the charges. And why did he offer the King of the Jews, according to Mark?
Because he knew that they'd handed him over because of envy.
Yeah. And so who is they?
Chief priest.
Chief priest, yeah. And there's that verb again, handed him over. That was the same verb that we saw where they handed him over to Pilate. That here is, he gets to the true motive of what the chief priest was. The chief priest's motive involved jealousy. They were jealous of Jesus. We're not told specifically what it was about Jesus, but you would imagine it's the following he had. It's the ability that he had to bring people to follow him and understand his teaching, which would be seen as a threat to their own status quo. And so all those things. And so Pilate gets to their motive here, and Mark recognizes that. But the chief priests then stir up the crowd, and they are the ones who bring up the idea of releasing Barabbas. So the crowd brings up the idea of the custom. Pilate asked, what should I give you, Jesus? And then the chief priest, at their insistence of stirring up the crowd, that's what leads to the release of Barabbas. And so that leads to this understanding of this revolutionary and murderer is going to be freed. The innocent king is going to be slain. Through that whole section, Jesus actually, doesn't seem like Jesus is there. He's not mentioned. So this is things that are happening around him as we hear of Barabbas and Pilate in the crowd. So let's read what happens next, 12 through 15. Someone could read that portion.
Can read that, Matthew.
Thank you, Melissa.
Pilate replied, "Then what do you want me to do with the one you call King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Why? What wrong has he done?" They shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd, so he released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus whipped, then handed him over to be crucified.
Thank you very much. So it's interesting again, is that so Pilate in one sense has offered Jesus up to be released, And in this second go at it, he's not the one who actually decides to crucify Jesus. He defers to the crowd. He asked, okay, well, what should I do with this one you call the King of the Jews? There's that term again. And the response of the crowd is immediately, and they shouted all the more. It's like they shouted over and over is the way that's done. And they asked Pilate to execute Jesus. They want him to be crucified, which was the most kind of painful death in the Roman legal process. Pilate asked the question, though, what evil has he done? So the implication is that he hasn't done any evil, and Pilate recognizes that he's done nothing. And we know, because we've been following the story, that Jesus has done no evil. In fact, he's done good. But the crowd, again, is insistent, crucify him. And so Pilate gives in, and we're told why he gives in. It's to satisfy the crowd. That's his motive for doing this. And he then releases Barabbas, and after flogging Jesus, handed him over. There's that word again, handed over. That's his fulfillment of the passion predictions. And so there's no hint that Pilate finds Jesus guilty of any crime. It's just the same as back when John the Baptist, when Herod gave in to pressure to kill John the Baptist. Here is Pilate giving into the pressure of the crowd to crucify Jesus and to hand him over to this act. Any thoughts in the Barabbas and the call for his crucifixion of Jesus section?
Well, the reason Pilate was there was because it was a high festival and there was always a chance of trouble. And I think he was obeying the crowd in order to keep the peace.
Yeah, you could see that as a motive of keeping the peace, because that's half the reason he's there, is he doesn't want an uprising. So
That's right.
yeah.
And these people are a mob.
Yep.
These are not the same people that were there on Palm Sunday.
Yeah. So we see that this continues then in 16. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. They clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. They began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. After Pilate hands him over, it's basically the soldiers that he's handed over to. They're leading him. And this is the Roman aggression kind of begins, and this mockery that they have. And they begin to insult him inside the governor's headquarters, in the courtyard there. And it's a whole cohort that gathers. And what we have is what do they put on Jesus? A couple things here.
A robe,
A
purple
robe
robe.
that's purple.
Purple robe.
So purple robe would indicate, what's the color purple?
Royalty.
Royalty. So you have royalty. You have, what else?
A thorn of
Crown
crown
of
of
thorns.
thorns.
That would be there. And then you have the action is a salute. And the statement is hell, which who normally receives that statement?
Caesar.
Caesar is Hail Caesar. So that's what you do to the emperor. And so here is this mocking coronation. That's what this really is. It's a coronation. The king receives his robe. The king receives his crown. The king then receives the salute of the people. And here it is. Jesus is receiving it all in an ironic way. This is Mark, I think, telling us Jesus is getting ready to go to his throne. And they don't realize that they're really doing this thing, just like the woman that had prepared him for burial and anointed him. I think in the same sense here, is these people are preparing him to go to the cross. And they're proclaiming the truth, even in their insults. the fact that Jesus is the King of the Jews. And it's as the suffering Jesus that he truly is shown to be the King of the Jews. His suffering is part and parcel of what it means for him to be king. And so they strike him, they spit upon him, they're kneeling down. It's all a recognition of Jesus's royalty. And they're unwittingly, unknowingly saying and doing the things that are indeed the truth. And they're demonstrating that Jesus is in fact a king, but he's not a king in the human terms that we normally see kings within our world. And ultimately, then, though the mockery does come to an end, after taking off the purple cloak, they put his own clothes back on him, and he turns toward the cross. Any thoughts about that coronation scene, as I call it? So it switched back then. So we had Jesus, Barabbas, Jesus, the soldiers, and now we come to Jesus being at the very center of this again in 21 to 25. Then they compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him, divided his clothes among them, and casting lots to decide which each should take. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. So what I find interesting here in these verses is the events described are entirely concerned with things that are done to Jesus by the Romans as he is led up to Golgotha and crucified. If you look through there, the subject of every verb, what's the subject of the verbs here? Verse 21, the verb compelled, the subject of it is what?
Soldiers.
Is that what yours says?
No,
They.
it's just they.
Yeah, and you notice it's they compelled. They brought Jesus. They offered him. They crucified him, divided his lots, and so forth. So it is this sense in which they, this third person plural, compelled, brought, offered, crucified, divided, and then crucified. These are all things that they, whoever they are doing to Jesus. And so it's not, these are all things that Jesus allows to happen to him. He is allowing all of this to happen. The first thing they do is they compel a passerby. His name is Simon of Cyrene. He just kind of happened to be there. He's coming in from the country, and we're told, the other thing we're told is he's from Cyrene, which would have been, does anyone know where Cyrene is? It is
It's Libya.
Libya, yeah, it's some North Africa is this. So if you think about that, he likely then would have been visiting for the Passover as a Jewish person from the dispersion. So he would have been one of the Jews who was dispersed, and so he's coming, and he is also pointed out that he is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now we don't really know who these two are, but they might have been well-known. They must have been well-known people in the early church. And so these two people would have been recognized by, I think, Mark's original readers. And Simon is compelled to do what?
Carry the cross.
So, yeah. So interesting is he is carrying the cross. The word actually, it says he was compelled to carry his cross. Some commentators point out that could have a double meaning. To carry Jesus's cross, but also to carry his own cross. It could be seen as both ways, and in a sense, Simon is doing both of those things. He is carrying the cross that belongs to Jesus, but ultimately that's the cross that brings him salvation as well. So that's this idea. The other thing in carrying a cross is who in the gospel is called to carry a cross?
Followers of Christ.
Followers of Christ, disciples. Here is Simon taking up the cross, doing what it means to be a disciple. And I think he becomes and transformed into the true disciple here, showing us that although his disciples, his apostles have left him and fled, here is one who is a disciple. He shows us what discipleship means, to take up the cross and to follow Jesus. So it is that sense here that Simon is transformed into a true disciple. Then they brought Jesus and they brought him to Golgotha. Mark translates that for us. It is an Aramaic word that means the place of the skull, or place of a skull. A lot of people say it's called that not because necessarily that's where crucifixion took place, but because it actually looked like a skull. And so that is the skull place. And then they offer him wine mixed with myrrh. What would wine mixed with myrrh do?
Kind of a numbing effect, maybe.
Yeah, it probably was some sort of numbing effect that would have helped to deaden maybe some of the pain. And so they point out that Jesus didn't take it, right? And so in a sense, he took on the full pain. He's not numb to what's happening to him. He refuses that. It is, in a sense, an act of compassion, maybe the only act of compassion that we see that the soldiers do to Jesus, but they offer him that this hint of compassion. Then they crucified him, and so the crucifixion, of course, it's interesting. A lot of times we go to Easter kind of passion plays, this kind of thing, and they have a whole lot of focus on this scene, but the gospel writers tell the crucifixion rather quickly. They don't focus as much on the gory details as on the meaning of what it was that happened here. And I think that is interesting that they quickly say it without giving us a lot of the detail. And of course, Jesus's the audience that Mark was writing to would have been familiar, I think, with what happened through that. Then they divided his clothes, casting lots to decide what each should take. This actually is a fulfillment. Does anyone have an indication? This is a psalm that is fulfilled here.
22.
So yeah, Psalm 22, which is if you ever read Psalm 22, a lot of church traditions will read Psalm 22 on Maundy, Thursday, and at the end of the service, because it is the same one that begins, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Which will come into play later on. And it is a psalm of lament that focuses on the righteous sufferer, someone who suffers innocently. And so this psalm is used several times within the Passion narrative, and shows us, first of all, I think, to remind us of that psalm, that Jesus is suffering as an innocent sufferer. And secondly, to remind us that this is a fulfillment of Scripture, that what is happening here was all part of God's design, and it's fulfilling those plans. And so then the last thing we're told is it was at the third hour in many translations, which would be what time?
12.
9 o'clock
12.
actually in the morning is when this actually is the third hour. So this it's hard to we try to reconcile all these times. It's interesting. This was an all-day affair in some sense of how all this was happening. Mark specifically has references we're going to see to the 6th hour and the 9th hour in 1533 and 34. And so this is a thing, significant things. I think by pointing out these significant time periods, I think it's a way that Mark again is, first of all, highlighting the significance of the events by telling us the time. And secondly, pointing out that, again, I think this is part of God's design, that here these things are happening, and it's happening at this time, and it's all part of the plan. And so Jesus has been crucified. Any thoughts or questions or observations on anything that we talked about tonight in this section?
When you asked or talked about Alexander and Rufus,
Mm-hmm.
I looked, the footnote here said they were mentioned here probably because they become well known in later in the early church. And then it refers us to Romans 16:13. I looked that up, and it only mentions Rufus. So
Yeah, I don't know, Alexander. There is that Rufus mentioned in that passage that could be the same Rufus as a possibility. But I think that these guys must have became, I think, followers of Jesus in the early church. And I think maybe Simon himself became one of those followers, and then his children followed in his footsteps. It's always fun to try to because we're not told the rest of Simon's story, to try to figure that out. You hear that one song that's Watch the Lamb that tries to tell the story in that way. So there's creative ways to kind of think through what was really happening. And so if you think about that in the way that when the song does it, they imply that the two boys, maybe Rufus and Alexander, were there with him. So any other thoughts? How does, or impressions of this part? What you don't love to read about the crucifixion. It's hard to read about the passion of Jesus, but at the same time, the way in which these writers, all four of the Gospels, tell us about it, it always just never ceases to amaze me how the things that we're saying about Jesus were all being the truth, and that they're really pointing out that the throne is the cross, that this is the place where Jesus's kingship is demonstrated, and that this is where the true identity of Jesus is seen. And I think on the cross is the clearest expression of God's love. That if you want to, and it's more of a John idea, but if you want to see what God is like, look at Jesus and see his love being poured out on the cross. And that's the love that Christ has for us, that he is the king, the Son of God, the Messiah who will suffer so that we might have life, so that we might have salvation. And it's ultimately a beautiful story in the way that that's told. All right. No final thoughts. We will take a moment here for prayer. Let me stop the recording first. Let's see.